There are moments in history that seem to belong only to kings, moments shaped by armies, battles, crowns, and thrones, moments remembered because they changed the fate of nations. Yet hidden behind many of those great events are quieter stories, stories of people whose names are barely remembered, people who never commanded armies, never delivered famous speeches, and never stood before cheering crowds. And sometimes those forgotten stories reveal the deepest truths of all. The story of Mephibosheth is one of them. It is the story of a child who lost everything before he was old enough to understand what loss truly meant. It is the story of a prince who grew up in exile, a man who spent years believing his life had been permanently defined by tragedy, a man who learned what it felt like to be forgotten. And yet, it is also the story of an unexpected kindness that changed everything. Because there are moments when life seems to close every door, and then, without warning, one opens. Not because we earned it, not because we planned it, but because someone remembered a promise. Long before Mephibosheth was born, the nation of Israel was experiencing one of the most important transitions in its history. For generations, God had led his people through judges, men and women raised up during specific times to guide, protect, and deliver the nation. But eventually, the people became restless. They looked at the surrounding nations and saw kings, visible rulers, powerful leaders, men who stood at the center of national identity. And they wanted the same. They wanted a king they could see, a king who would lead them into battle, a king who would make them feel secure. Despite warnings from the prophet Samuel, the people persisted. And so God allowed Saul to become Israel's first king. At first, Saul appeared to be everything the people desired. He was impressive in appearance. Scripture tells us that he stood head and shoulders above everyone else. He looked like a king. He carried himself like a king. He inspired confidence. The future seemed bright. But leadership is tested not during moments of celebration. It is tested during moments of pressure. And over time, cracks began to appear. Saul struggled with obedience. He struggled with patience. He struggled with trusting God's direction when circumstances became difficult. Little by little, fear began to replace faith. Pride began to influence his decisions. The man who once appeared strong gradually became insecure, and insecurity is a dangerous companion for anyone in power, because insecure leaders often see threats where none exist. They become suspicious, defensive, fearful, and eventually destructive. Yet within Saul's household lived someone very different, his son, Jonathan. If Saul represented the tragedy of potential slowly lost, Jonathan represented the beauty of character fully formed. He was courageous, loyal, humble, respected throughout Israel, a warrior whose bravery inspired others, a prince who carried responsibility with honor. Many expected Jonathan to someday inherit his father's throne. Everything about his life pointed in that direction, but God was preparing another path. Far from the royal court, a shepherd boy named David was growing up among the hills of Bethlehem. No one looking at David's early life would have imagined what lay ahead. He was the youngest son in his family, a keeper of sheep, a boy who spent long hours alone beneath open skies. Yet, while others overlooked him, God did not. When the prophet Samuel arrived in Bethlehem and examined Jesse's sons, he initially assumed the oldest and strongest would be chosen. But God reminded him of something that remains true throughout history. People look at outward appearance. God looks at the heart. And so, David was anointed. Not publicly as king, not immediately as ruler, but as the one God had chosen for the future. Years would pass before anyone fully understood what that meant. At first, David entered Saul's service as a musician. When troubling spirits tormented the king, David's music brought relief. Then came the moment that changed everything. The giant Goliath. For 40 days, the Philistine champion challenged Israel. For 40 days, trained soldiers refused to fight him. Fear spread throughout the army. Even Saul hesitated. Then a shepherd boy stepped forward, not because he believed in his own strength, but because he believed in God. The outcome became one of the most famous moments in Scripture. One stone, one giant, one victory that transformed David's future forever. Suddenly, the shepherd became a national hero. Songs were written about him. Stories spread across the kingdom. His reputation grew, and it was during this season that Jonathan truly came to know him. The friendship that developed between them would become one of the strongest relationships recorded in the Bible. It made little sense from a political perspective. Jonathan was the prince. David was becoming increasingly popular. If David continued rising, Jonathan's own claim to the throne would diminish. Many men would have viewed David as a rival. Many would have viewed him as a threat. Jonathan saw something else. He saw God's hand. He saw God's purpose, and instead of resisting it, he embraced it. The bond between the two men became extraordinarily deep. Scripture describes their souls as being knit together. They trusted one another completely. They respected one another deeply. And together, they made a covenant before God. A solemn promise of loyalty, a commitment that would extend beyond the circumstances of the present. Neither man could fully understand how important that covenant would eventually become. For now, they simply knew they were brothers in spirit, friends united by faith. But while their friendship grew stronger, Saul's fear grew darker. The songs celebrating David's victories echoed throughout Israel. Women sang that Saul had slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. To many people, the songs were harmless celebrations. To Saul, they felt like a warning. Jealousy began taking root, and jealousy rarely remains small. It grows, quietly at first, then relentlessly. Soon, Saul began viewing David not as a servant, not as a hero, not as a blessing, but as a threat. Again and again he sought opportunities to destroy him. Again and again, David was forced to flee. The future king became a fugitive, living in caves, hiding in wilderness regions, constantly moving, constantly surviving. Throughout these difficult years, Jonathan remained loyal. His loyalty cost him greatly. Supporting David created tension within his own family. It placed him in painful situations. It forced him to choose between political advantage and faithfulness. Again and again, Jonathan chose faithfulness because true loyalty often demands sacrifice. One of their most moving conversations occurred during this difficult period. Jonathan knew what many others refused to accept. He knew David would one day become king. He knew God's plan could not be stopped. And rather than fighting that reality, he accepted it with humility. During one of their meetings, the two men renewed their covenant. Jonathan asked David to show kindness to his descendants in the future, not merely to him, but to his family, to those who would come after him. David agreed. The promise was made, the covenant strengthened, and then life moved forward. Neither man knew how quickly circumstances would change. Years later, Israel found itself facing a familiar enemy, the Philistines. Tension grew, armies assembled, the nation prepared for battle. The confrontation would take place near Mount Gilboa. It would become one of the darkest days in Israel's history. The fighting was fierce, the losses were devastating. Israel's army began to collapse. The Philistines pushed forward relentlessly. One by one, members of Saul's family fell in battle. Among them was Jonathan, the faithful prince, the loyal friend, the courageous warrior, dead on the battlefield. Before the day ended, Saul himself would also die. The first king of Israel was gone. His heir was gone. The kingdom had been thrown into chaos. Across the land, messengers carried the terrible news. Villages learned of the defeat. Families mourned their dead. And inside the royal household, panic spread rapidly because everyone understood the danger. A king had fallen, a dynasty had collapsed, and history offered many examples of what happened next. When power changed hands in the ancient world, surviving members of royal families often became targets. Potential rivals were rarely tolerated. Potential heirs could become dangerous symbols. Fear filled the palace. People began making decisions quickly, urgently, desperately. Among them was a nurse caring for a 5-year-old child, a child who had no understanding of military defeat, no understanding of dynastic politics, no understanding that his world was falling apart around him. That child was Mephibosheth. And before the sun set on that terrible season, his life would be changed forever. The news traveled faster than anyone could have imagined. Defeat has a way of moving swiftly through a nation. By the time the first messengers arrived from Mount Gilboa, fear had already begun spreading across Israel. People whispered in marketplaces. Families gathered inside their homes. Soldiers returning from battle carried stories filled with grief and uncertainty. The king was dead. Jonathan was dead. The royal army had been broken. No one knew what would happen next. Inside Saul's household, panic quickly replaced normal life. Servants rushed through corridors. Families gathered their belongings. Decisions were made in moments that would affect entire lifetimes. And somewhere within that atmosphere of confusion and fear was a little boy, 5 years old, too young to understand the significance of what had happened, too young to know that history had suddenly changed direction, too young to realize that he was about to lose nearly everything. Mephibosheth had been born into privilege. He was the grandson of a king, the son of a prince. His future should have been secure. Yet, history rarely asks what should have happened. It only records what did happen. The nurse responsible for caring for him understood the danger. Whether the threat was immediate or merely feared, she believed they could not stay. Every moment felt urgent. Every delay seemed dangerous. So she gathered the child and fled. Perhaps she carried him in her arms. Perhaps she hurried through crowded passageways filled with frightened people. Perhaps she heard distant reports and imagined approaching enemies. Scripture gives us only a brief description, yet those few words carry enormous weight. In the chaos of the escape, Mephibosheth fell or was dropped. The exact details remain unknown, but the consequences lasted for the rest of his life. His feet were permanently injured. The child became crippled. In a single season, tragedy struck from every direction. His grandfather was gone. His father was gone. His home was gone. His position was gone. And now his physical health was gone as well. Some people experience suffering gradually, a difficulty here, a disappointment there, a challenge that develops over years. For Mephibosheth, suffering arrived all at once. The kind of suffering that changes the entire course of a life. The kind of suffering that divides existence into two parts, before and after. Before Mount Gilboa, after Mount Gilboa, before the fall, after the fall, before security, after loss. As the years passed, David gradually rose to power. The kingdom that Saul once ruled became David's kingdom. At first, the transition was not immediate. Political tensions remained. Different groups supported different leaders. The nation experienced uncertainty. Yet little by little, David's position became stronger. The tribes united. Enemies were defeated. Jerusalem became the center of national life. The kingdom expanded. The nation prospered. Meanwhile, far from the palace, another story unfolded, a quieter story, a forgotten story, the story of Mephibosheth. Eventually, he came to live in a place called Lo-Debar. It was a place far removed from influence and power, far from royal celebrations, far from military victories, far from the center of history. For someone born into the royal family, the contrast could not have been greater. Once, his future had been connected to the throne. Now, he lived in obscurity. Once, servants would have attended to his needs. Now, life was defined by limitation. Once, people may have spoken his name with expectation. Now, few spoke it at all. Years turned into more years. Seasons passed. Children grew into adults. Events unfolded throughout Israel. And Mephibosheth remained largely forgotten, at least forgotten by people, but not forgotten by God. There is something profoundly human about his situation. Most people will never lose a kingdom. Most people will never belong to a royal family. But many understand what it means to lose the future they imagined. Many understand disappointment. Many understand watching life move in a direction they never expected. Perhaps there were moments when Mephibosheth thought about his father. Stories of Jonathan must have followed him throughout his life. Stories of courage, stories of loyalty, stories of faith. Stories of a man admired throughout the nation. What would it be like to grow up hearing such stories while knowing you would never create new memories with him? What would it be like to know your father only through the words of others? Perhaps there were moments when he wondered what life would have been like if that terrible day had never happened. What if the battle had ended differently? What if Saul had survived? What if Jonathan had returned home? What if he had never fallen during the escape? Questions like these often accompany suffering. Questions that have no answers. Questions that remain long after the events themselves. Yet, while Mephibosheth lived in Lo-Debar, another man carried memories of Jonathan as well. King David. Years had passed since their friendship. Years had passed since the covenant they had made. Years had passed since Jonathan's death. But some promises refuse to disappear. Some relationships leave marks too deep to erase. David had not forgotten. How could he? Jonathan had stood beside him during some of the darkest moments of his life. When Saul hunted him, when uncertainty surrounded him, when danger followed him, Jonathan had remained faithful, loyal, true. Friendships like that are rare, and David remembered. One day, after his kingdom had become firmly established, after victories had been won and stability achieved, David found himself thinking about the past. Perhaps he remembered conversations beneath open skies. Perhaps he remembered Jonathan's encouragement during difficult times. Perhaps he remembered the covenant they had made before God. Whatever prompted the moment, David asked a remarkable question. A question that would change Mephibosheth's life forever. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? It was not a political question. It was not a military question. It was not even a practical question. It was a question born from loyalty, a question born from gratitude, a question born from love for a friend who had been gone for many years. In the ancient world, such a question was unusual. Kings did not typically search for descendants of former royal families in order to bless them. History offered countless examples of the opposite. Rulers often removed potential rivals, eliminated threats, secured power through fear. Yet David's heart moved in another direction. He wanted to show kindness, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Eventually, a man named Ziba was brought before him. Ziba had served Saul's household. If anyone knew whether descendants remained, it would be him. David asked his question again. Was there anyone left? Anyone at all? And the answer changed everything. Yes, there was still one, a son of Jonathan, alive, living far from Jerusalem, a man crippled in both feet. For a moment, imagine Mephibosheth at that exact time, living his ordinary life, completely unaware of the conversation taking place in the palace, completely unaware that the king was speaking his name, completely unaware that a promise made before he was born was about to reach across decades and transform his future. The king listened carefully. Then he asked a simple question, "Where is he?" Because the moment David learned that Jonathan's son was alive, he did not hesitate. He did not delay. He did not reconsider. He immediately began moving toward the fulfillment of a promise. And far away in Lo-Debar, Mephibosheth had no idea that everything was about to change. No idea that the next chapter of his life was already beginning. No idea that a king remembered him. No idea that grace was already on its way. The answer changed everything. A son of Jonathan was still alive. Not only alive, but known by name, known by location, known by people who could lead the king directly to him. For years, Mephibosheth had lived far from the center of power, far from the palace, far from the decisions that shaped the nation. Yet now, suddenly, the king was asking where he lived, and David did not hesitate. As soon as he learned the answer, he sent for him. The command left Jerusalem and traveled toward Lo-Debar. Royal messengers carried the summons. The king wanted to see Jonathan's son. What must Mephibosheth have thought when they arrived? The Bible does not tell us, but human nature allows us to imagine. For years, he had lived quietly. For years, he had remained outside the political spotlight. For years, he had survived by staying unnoticed. Then one day, royal representatives appeared. The king was calling for him, not requesting, not inviting, summoning. A message like that could easily create fear. After all, history offered many reasons to be afraid. Throughout the ancient world, surviving descendants of former royal families often lived under suspicion. A king might view them as threats, potential rivals, potential claimants to power, even if they had no intention of seeking a throne. The mere possibility could create danger. Mephibosheth knew who he was. He knew whose grandson he was. He knew whose son he was, and now David wanted to see him. Perhaps questions flooded his mind. Why now? Why after all these years? What does the king want? What happens next? No one can say for certain, but it is difficult to imagine that he traveled to Jerusalem without anxiety. Eventually, he arrived. The city itself must have felt overwhelming. Years had passed since his childhood, years spent away from the center of national life. Now he entered the capital of the kingdom, the city of David, the place where decisions were made, the place where power resided, the place where his future would soon change forever. Then came the moment. The forgotten son of Jonathan stood before the king. Scripture tells us that Mephibosheth bowed down. He fell on his face before David, a gesture of humility, a gesture of respect, perhaps even a gesture of fear. Then David spoke, not with anger, not with suspicion, not with accusation. He simply called his name, Mephibosheth. Imagine hearing your name spoken by the most powerful man in the nation. Imagine realizing that the king knows who you are. The man answered, "Your servant." Then David immediately addressed what was likely the greatest emotion in the room: fear. Do not be afraid. Those 4 words changed everything. Before discussing land, before discussing inheritance, before discussing the future, David addressed fear, because fear was standing there in front of him, fear born from uncertainty, fear born from loss, fear born from years of living on the margins. Do not be afraid. How many lives throughout history have been transformed by hearing those words? How many people have carried burdens that began to lift the moment someone spoke peace into their uncertainty? David continued, "I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan." Kindness. The word itself must have sounded unbelievable. Mephibosheth had not come expecting kindness. At least nothing in the story suggests he did. Yet kindness was exactly why he had been called. Not because of political advantage, not because of usefulness, not because of personal achievement, because of a promise. Because David remembered Jonathan. Because David remained faithful to a covenant made years before. Then came something even more astonishing. David told him that all the land belonging to Saul would be restored to him. All of it. The inheritance that had seemed permanently lost. The family property. The resources connected to his lineage. The security that had vanished after Mount Gilboa. David was giving it back. For a man who had spent years in Lo-Debar, the announcement must have seemed impossible. One day, he was living in obscurity. The next, the king was restoring an inheritance he likely assumed was gone forever. Yet, David was not finished. The greatest gift was still to come. "You shall always eat at my table." Always, not occasionally, not during festivals, not during special celebrations. Always. The significance of those words cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, eating at a king's table was not merely about food. It represented acceptance, honor, relationship, belonging. The king was not simply giving Mephibosheth property, he was giving him a place, a permanent place. The former exile would now live as a member of the royal household. The forgotten prince would sit among the king's sons. The man who spent years hidden away would be welcomed into daily fellowship with the ruler of Israel. No wonder Mephibosheth struggled to comprehend it. His response reveals genuine astonishment. "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" The expression sounds harsh today, but it reveals how deeply tragedy had shaped his self-perception. Years of loss, years of limitation, years of obscurity, years of survival, all had influenced the way he viewed himself. He did not see himself as important. He did not see himself as deserving honor. He did not expect favor. Yet grace often arrives precisely where expectations have disappeared. David was not evaluating Mephibosheth's worthiness. He was honoring a covenant, a promise, a friendship. Immediately, the king took practical steps to ensure the restoration would be lasting. Ziba, Saul's former servant, was summoned. David instructed him and his household to cultivate the land on Mephibosheth's behalf. The fields would be maintained, the harvests would provide income, the inheritance would remain productive, the future would be secure. Meanwhile, Mephibosheth himself would live in Jerusalem, not as an outsider, not as a guest passing through, but as someone permanently welcomed into the king's household. Scripture records the result with beautiful simplicity. Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Like one of the king's sons, the words carry enormous weight. A child who lost everything, a boy whose future collapsed in a single day, a man who spent years hidden in Lo-Debar, now seated among royalty, now welcomed into fellowship, now treated as family. The contrast is breathtaking, from exile to belonging, from obscurity to honor, from loss to restoration. And perhaps nowhere is the transformation more visible than in the image Scripture leaves us with: a table, the king's table. Each day Mephibosheth would take his place there. Each day he would sit alongside others in the royal household. Each day he would be reminded that grace had rewritten his story. There is also a quiet detail many readers notice. When seated at the table, his crippled feet would no longer be visible. The table covered the very injury that had defined so much of his life. The disability remained, the scars remained, the past remained, but they no longer determined his identity. He was no longer known primarily by what he had lost. He was known by where he belonged. For a season, life in Jerusalem must have seemed almost unbelievable. The years in Lo-Debar were behind him. The future looked secure. The covenant had been fulfilled. The king had shown kindness. And it seemed as though the story had reached its happy ending. But life rarely moves in straight lines. Even after restoration comes, new challenges often appear. And in the years ahead, David's kingdom would face one of its greatest crises, a crisis that would once again place Mephibosheth in a position of uncertainty, a crisis that would test loyalty, reveal character, and uncover the true condition of his heart. For a time, peace returned to Jerusalem. The kingdom stabilized once again. The fields belonging to Saul's family produced their harvests. The royal household continued its routines. And Mephibosheth lived in a reality he could scarcely have imagined during those lonely years in Lo-Debar. Each day he sat at the king's table, Each day, he experienced the fulfillment of a promise made long before he was born. Each day, he lived as a testimony to the power of remembered kindness. Scripture briefly mentions that Mephibosheth had a son named Micah. The detail is small, but meaningful. The family line had survived. The future had not ended with tragedy. A new generation had emerged. A new chapter had begun. The child who once fled for his life had become a father. The boy who lost everything had lived long enough to watch life continue. Yet even in times of peace, the seeds of future conflict can quietly grow. And nowhere was that more true than within David's own family. Among David's sons was a man named Absalom, handsome, charismatic, intelligent, a man capable of attracting admiration wherever he went. People were naturally drawn to him. He possessed the kind of presence that could command attention simply by entering a room. Over time, however, ambition began to take root. Slowly, patiently, dangerously. Absalom started winning the hearts of the people. He positioned himself as an alternative to his father. He listened to grievances. He made promises. He cultivated loyalty. And before long, what began as influence became rebellion. The crisis escalated rapidly. Supporters rallied to Absalom's cause. Political alliances shifted. Uncertainty spread throughout the kingdom. David soon realized a painful truth. Jerusalem was no longer safe. The king would have to leave. And so, years after establishing his throne, David found himself fleeing his capital. It was one of the most heartbreaking moments of his reign, not because he was running from a foreign army, not because he was facing a powerful enemy, but because the threat came from his own son. Scripture describes scenes filled with sorrow. Loyal followers accompanied him. Families wept. The future seemed uncertain once again. No one knew how the conflict would end. As David departed Jerusalem, an unexpected figure appeared. Ziba, the servant who had been entrusted with managing Mephibosheth's land. He arrived carrying provisions, donkeys, food, supplies. Everything seemed to suggest loyalty. Everything seemed to suggest support. Naturally, David asked a question. Where is Mephibosheth? The answer he received must have been deeply disappointing. Ziba claimed that Mephibosheth had remained behind in Jerusalem. According to his story, Jonathan's son believed the rebellion might somehow restore Saul's kingdom to his family. The accusation was serious, extremely serious. If true, it would represent betrayal. The very man who had received David's kindness would now be hoping for David's downfall. The very man welcomed to the king's table would now be waiting to benefit from the king's suffering. Placed in an urgent situation and possessing only one side of the story, David responded quickly. He granted Mephibosheth's property to Ziba. The decision was made. The kingdom continued moving through crisis. The rebellion intensified. The conflict eventually reached its climax. Absalom's forces were defeated. The rebellion collapsed, and David prepared to return to Jerusalem. The king, who had left in sorrow, was now coming home. As he traveled back toward the city, many people came out to meet him. Some sought forgiveness, some sought reconciliation. Some simply wished to welcome him home. Among them was Mephibosheth, and what David saw immediately raised questions. Scripture tells us that from the day David left Jerusalem until the day he returned safely, Mephibosheth had not cared for his feet. He had not trimmed his beard. He had not washed his clothes. These details may seem small to modern readers, but in the ancient world, they communicated something powerful. They were signs of mourning, signs of grief, signs of distress. This was not the appearance of a man celebrating David's absence. This was the appearance of a man who had been deeply troubled by it. David looked at him and asked the obvious question, "Why didn't you go with me?" The answer revealed a very different story. Mephibosheth explained that because of his disability, he depended on assistance for travel. He had intended to accompany the king. He had instructed that a donkey be prepared. But Ziba had deceived him. Instead of helping him leave, Ziba abandoned him. Then, according to Mephibosheth, he slandered him before David. Suddenly, the situation looked very different. The king now faced conflicting accounts. One story from Ziba, another from Mephibosheth. Determining every detail may have been difficult, but some things were impossible to ignore. The condition of Mephibosheth's appearance, his grief, his humility, his attitude. And then came the statement that reveals more about his character than perhaps anything else in his story. David suggested dividing the property between him and Ziba, a compromise, a practical solution. But Mephibosheth's response was remarkable. Let him take everything, the fields, the harvests, the income, the property, all of it. Then he explained why. Now that my lord the king has returned home safely, in that moment, the true condition of his heart became visible. The land was not what mattered most. The inheritance was not what mattered most. The wealth was not what mattered most. David's safe return mattered more. The relationship mattered more. The king mattered more. That is the language of gratitude. Years earlier, Mephibosheth expected nothing. David gave him everything. Years later, when conflict threatened that relationship, possessions became secondary, because grateful hearts view life differently. Grateful people remember. They remember kindness. They remember mercy. They remember the people who helped them when they could not help themselves. And gratitude often produces loyalty, the kind of loyalty that remains when circumstances become difficult, the kind of loyalty that survives misunderstanding, the kind of loyalty that cannot be purchased. As the biblical account draws to a close, Mephibosheth quietly fades from the spotlight. No great military victories are attached to his name, no famous speeches, no dramatic miracles, no throne, no crown. Yet his story continues to endure, because greatness is not always found in power. Sometimes greatness appears in faithfulness, in gratitude, in humility, in the way a person responds to suffering, in the way they respond to kindness. Many people spend their lives asking why painful things happen, why dreams disappear, why opportunities vanish, why tragedy arrives without warning. Mephibosheth never received answers to all those questions. The story does not tell us that he understood why his father died, why he became crippled, why his childhood unfolded as it did. Those questions remained, yet his life demonstrates something important. A painful beginning does not have to determine the ending. For years, Lo-Debar appeared to be the final chapter, a place of obscurity, a place of loss, a place where forgotten stories disappeared, but it was not the end. The chapter that seemed permanent turned out to be temporary. The future that appeared lost was not truly gone. Beyond the horizon, unseen by Mephibosheth, a promise was moving toward him, and perhaps That is one reason his story continues to resonate after so many centuries. Because many people know what it feels like to live in their own version of Lo-Debar, a season of disappointment, a season of loneliness, a season of uncertainty, a season where the future appears smaller than it once did. Yet this story reminds us that life is often larger than the chapter we are currently living. There may be promises we cannot yet see. There may be opportunities we cannot yet imagine. There may be acts of kindness already moving toward us. Mephibosheth could not see David remembering him. He could not hear the conversations taking place in Jerusalem. He could not know that a covenant made decades earlier was about to transform his future. But it was. And when the moment arrived, everything changed. The friendship between David and Jonathan also leaves behind a timeless lesson. True loyalty is rare. Many relationships survive only while circumstances remain favorable. Many promises disappear when they become inconvenient. But David remembered. He remained faithful long after it would have been easy to forget. Long after Jonathan was gone. Long after circumstances had changed. Long after everyone else had moved on. Integrity remembers. Faithfulness remembers. Love remembers. And because David remembered, a forgotten man found restoration. If this story has stayed with you, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing in the comments which moment impacted you most. And if you enjoy cinematic biblical stories that bring Scripture to life, there are many more journeys waiting for you here. As the years passed and the great events of Israel's history continued unfolding, the story of Mephibosheth remained quietly woven into the larger story of God's people, a prince who never became king, a child marked by tragedy, a man hidden in obscurity, a son who lost his father, a survivor who found a place at the king's table long after armies disappeared and kingdoms faded into history. His story continued speaking, because beneath every detail lies a truth that never grows old. People may forget, circumstances may change, dreams may seem lost, but kindness has the power to rewrite destinies. Faithfulness has the power to outlive generations, and sometimes the most beautiful chapters of a story begin after everything seems broken. The tables of kings eventually vanish. The palaces of this world eventually crumble. The names of rulers eventually fade. But mercy endures. Loyalty endures. Grace endures. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Mephibosheth. Not that he sat at a king's table, but that he became living proof that a remembered promise can change a life forever. And even now, centuries later, his story still reminds us that no one is truly forgotten when they remain in the heart of someone faithful enough to remember.